I never expected my life to change forever that night. When I opened the bathroom door, I thought I was alone, until I heard breathing behind the shower curtain. My heart raced as I reached out, but what I saw when I pulled it back made my stomach drop. Standing there, drenched and trembling, was someone I never expected, and what they were hiding shattered everything I believed. I always believed my life was ordinary, maybe even a little boring. My husband, David, and I had built a comfortable routine. We were high school sweethearts who married young, thinking love alone would protect us from life's storms. For years, it felt like it did. David was the kind of man everyone admired, steady, reliable, and kind. He worked long hours at his law firm, determined to provide the best for us, and I admired his drive. I spent my days as a freelance graphic designer, working from home and keeping our little world intact. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Yet lately, something felt off. David had become distant, spending more nights at the office and coming home smelling like cologne that wasn't his. I brushed it off at first. Stress, I told myself. Deadlines and late-night meetings. But the doubt festered quietly, like a shadow creeping into the corners of our home. The nights alone grew longer, and the silence heavier. I started sleeping with the TV on just to drown out the emptiness. Even when David was home, he was distracted, his phone never out of reach, his gaze always somewhere else. I told myself not to overthink it, but the sinking feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. When the loneliness became unbearable, I turned to my brother, Ethan. He had always been my rock, the protective older sibling who never hesitated to step in when life got messy. After David left for another work trip, I packed an overnight bag and showed up at Ethan's door without warning. "Stay as long as you need," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt like home. Ethan's apartment was small but warm. He lived with his two best friends, Ryan and Lucas, both charming in their own ways, but always giving me space. The apartment felt lived in, messy, cluttered, but alive. It was the complete opposite of the sterile, quiet house I left behind. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But that feeling didn't last. Because as I settled into Ethan's apartment, the lines between comfort and chaos started to blur. And soon, I found myself questioning not just my marriage, but everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. At first, staying with Ethan felt like the escape I desperately needed. His apartment was always buzzing with life, a sharp contrast to the suffocating quiet of my home. Ethan and his friends, Ryan and Lucas, were laid back and easygoing, their laughter echoing through the halls. It was comforting, like being wrapped in a blanket of noise that drowned out my own thoughts. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed things that didn't quite add up. Ethan had always been protective, but now his concern felt different. He was more watchful, more guarded. I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering just a second too long. One night, I woke up to the sound of voices in the living room. The clock read 2:13 a.m. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, but the voices were too low to make out. I opened the door just enough to peek out. Ethan and Ryan stood near the window, their faces tense. "She can't find out," Ryan hissed. "She won't," Ethan replied. Their eyes darted to my door, and I froze, my pulse quickening. I waited until their footsteps faded before retreating to bed, but sleep never came. The next day, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. But the unease stayed with me, growing heavier with every passing moment. Then there was the bathroom incident. It happened late one night when I couldn't sleep. I decided a hot shower might help and tiptoed down the hall. Ethan's door was ajar and faint light spilled out, but I didn't stop. I needed to clear my head. I reached the bathroom and froze. The door was slightly open. I heard something breathing. Slow, steady, and too close. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open. The room was humid, the mirror fogged over. A damp towel lay crumpled on the floor. And then I saw it. The shower curtain swayed, ever so slightly. I swallowed hard. "Ethan," I whispered. No answer. I inched closer, heart pounding, and reached for the curtain. Before I could pull it back, the door creaked open behind me. I spun around to see Ethan standing there, his eyes dark and unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. I couldn't sleep," I stammered, stepping back. His gaze flicked to the shower, then back to me. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his tone firm. Confusion swirled in my mind, but something about his voice made me stop asking questions. I muttered an apology and slipped past him, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. What was he hiding? The next morning, Ethan acted like nothing had happened. He teased me about my messy hair, and offered me coffee like we were back to normal. But I couldn't forget the tension in his voice or the look in his eyes. And then there was Ryan. He started showing up more often, his conversations with Ethan growing shorter and sharper. Once I overheard him say, "We're running out of time." I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, that grief was making me paranoid. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The worst part? Despite the fear simmering beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the way I felt around Ethan. The safety, the warmth. And I hated myself for noticing how good he looked shirtless as he fixed the kitchen sink, or how his laughter sent shivers down my spine. Lines were blurring, boundaries crumbling. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. I told myself it was nothing. Just grief. Just loneliness. That's why my heart skipped every time Ethan touched my shoulder, or brushed past me in the kitchen. That's why I couldn't stop noticing the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long. But deep down I knew better. It started innocently enough. One night I was curled up on the couch, my knees tucked under a blanket, as I flipped through an old photo album. Ethan came home late, his hair damp from the rain, his jacket slung over his arm. "Can't sleep?" he asked, dropping onto the couch beside me. I shook my head. Too many memories. He leaned closer, glancing at the photo I had stopped on. One of us as kids, covered in mud after a long day of playing outside. He smiled softly. "You hated baths back then," he said. I laughed, the sound surprising me. "And you always made it worse, splashed me until I cried." "I wasn't that bad." "You were," I teased, nudging him with my elbow. He caught my hand before I could pull away. His grip was warm, steady. But when our eyes met, something shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy I didn't want to name. Neither of us spoke. I tried to look away, but his thumb brushed over my knuckles and I froze. My skin tingled under his touch, and my pulse quickened. "I missed this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Missed what?" "Us." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to break the moment. But instead, I let him hold my hand. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But the next morning, when I found him in the kitchen, shirtless and barefoot, his muscles flexing as he reached for the coffee mugs, I couldn't breathe. His eyes met mine and he smirked. "Morning." I muttered a response, grabbing my coffee and escaping before I did something stupid. But it didn't stop there. Later that day, I was in the living room, stretching out on my yoga mat. I thought I was alone until I heard Ethan's voice behind me. "Impressive," he said, leaning against the doorway. I looked up, startled. "What? You? Flexible." His lips curved into a slow smile. I flushed, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "It's just yoga." He stepped closer. "You make it look different." My stomach flipped. I tried to focus on my breathing, but the heat from his stare made it impossible. "You're staring," I said, trying to sound annoyed. "Maybe." He didn't even try to deny it. That night, the tension only grew. I was brushing my hair in the bathroom when Ethan knocked on the door. "Need something?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, stepping inside. I expected him to grab something and leave, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me in the mirror. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything feels wrong." He stepped closer, his reflection moving behind mine. "I know." His voice was so soft, so full of understanding, that it made my chest ache. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Claire." My breath hitched as he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered, brushing against my skin. I turned to face him, and suddenly we were too close, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Ethan." He didn't move. Neither did I. The space between us felt charged, electric. And then his hand cupped my cheek, his thumb grazing my jawline. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I knew it was wrong. I knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But in that moment I didn't care. He leaned in slowly, hesitantly, as if giving me a chance to stop him. But I didn't. And when his lips brushed against mine, the world fell away. The kiss was soft at first, uncertain, almost afraid. But then something snapped. He pulled me closer, his hands tangling in my hair, and I melted into him. It wasn't just a kiss. It was years of unsaid words, of buried feelings, of comfort and chaos colliding all at once. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. "This can't happen," I whispered, even as my body leaned toward him again. "I know," he said. But neither of us moved. Because in that moment it already had. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Ethan's lips on mine, his touch lingering on my skin like a phantom. My thoughts spun in endless circles, guilt, desire, fear, all crashing together until I didn't know what to feel anymore. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a mistake, a heat-of-the-moment lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and grief. But when I stepped into the kitchen and saw Ethan standing there, barefoot and tousled, all my resolve shattered. His eyes locked on mine, and I knew he felt it too. But before either of us could speak, the front door swung open, and Ryan strode in. "Morning," he said casually, but his eyes flicked between us, sharp and searching. Ethan tensed beside me, and suddenly, the room felt too small. "Can we talk?" Ryan asked, his gaze never leaving Ethan. Ethan glanced at me, then nodded. "Yeah, outside." They disappeared onto the balcony, and I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. Their voices were low, urgent, but fragments of their conversation bled through. "She's getting too close," Ryan hissed. "She doesn't know anything," Ethan snapped. "She suspects. And if she finds out—" "She won't," Ethan cut him off. "Silence." I stepped back as the balcony door slid open. Ethan walked in first, his expression unreadable, but Ryan's eyes lingered on me a beat too long. Whatever they were hiding, I was now certain it had something to do with me. The tension only grew as the day dragged on. Ethan avoided me, keeping his distance like he was afraid of what might happen if we were alone again. But I couldn't let it go. That night, I couldn't sleep. The questions swirling in my mind were too loud. I needed answers. I waited until the apartment was quiet, then crept toward Ethan's room. His door was slightly ajar, the glow of his bedside lamp spilling into the hall. I knocked softly. "Come in," he said. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "Ethan," I started, but he cut me off. "You shouldn't be here." "Don't do that," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't shut me out. I heard you and Ryan earlier. What's going on? What are you hiding from me?" His head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw it, the fear in his eyes. "It's not what you think," he said, but the words rang hollow. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. He stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I can't," he said finally. "You don't have a choice," I shot back. "I deserve the truth." He stopped, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. "It's about David," he said. My breath caught. "David? What about him?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "He wasn't who you thought he was, Claire." "What are you talking about?" Ethan hesitated, then crossed the room, opening the top drawer of his dresser. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. David with another woman. Laughing. Holding hands. Kissing. The world tilted beneath me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly. Tears blurred my vision as I flipped through the photos. "How long have you known?" "A few months," he admitted. I looked up at him, my voice trembling with anger. "And you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to," he said, stepping closer. "But you were already hurting so much. I didn't want to break you. You don't get to decide what I can handle." I shouted, shoving the folder at him. He caught it, but his eyes never left mine. "Claire," his voice softened, and before I could stop myself, I collapsed into his arms. He held me tightly as I sobbed, his hands running soothingly down my back. And then, before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine again. This time, there was no hesitation. No pulling away. It was raw, desperate, a collision of grief and passion, comfort and chaos. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. "I know," he said, brushing my hair back. "But I can't stop." Neither could I. But reality came crashing down the next morning. I woke up in Ethan's bed, tangled in his sheets, my body still humming from the night before. But as I reached for him, I found the bed empty. Panic set in as I pulled on my clothes and stumbled into the living room. Ryan and Lucas were there, their faces grim. "Where's Ethan?" I demanded. "He's gone," Ryan said. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" Ryan hesitated. "He went to fix something. Something he should have fixed a long time ago. The air left my lungs." "What does that mean?" "It means," Lucas said, his voice low, "that Ethan's trying to protect you. Even if it costs him everything." The apartment felt suffocating without Ethan. I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling. What did Ryan and Lucas mean? What was Ethan protecting me from? I tried calling him, once, twice, then 3 more times, but each call went straight to voicemail. "Tell me where he is," I demanded, turning to Ryan. He shook his head. "You need to let this go, Claire." "Let it go? Are you serious?" I snapped. "I woke up in his bed this morning, and now you're acting like he's disappeared off the face of the earth. What the hell is going on? Ryan's jaw tightened. You don't understand. No, I don't. I interrupted. Because no one is telling me anything. Lucas stood, stepping between us. Ethan asked us to keep you safe. That's all you need to know. Safe. The word echoed in my head, twisting into something dark and terrifying. Safe from what? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, flipping through the photos Ethan had shown me. My hands shook every time I looked at David's face. The man I thought I knew, the man I had trusted completely. He had lied to me. For how long? And why hadn't Ethan told me sooner? By nightfall, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, ignoring Ryan's protests. Ethan's car wasn't at his usual spots. His phone remained off. But something told me I'd find him at the one place that still held pieces of both our pasts, our parents' old cabin by the lake. The drive felt endless, the roads winding through thick trees that seemed to close in around me. By the time I arrived, the cabin was shrouded in darkness, but Ethan's truck was parked outside. Relief and dread battled inside me as I climbed the porch steps. I knocked once. Twice. No answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Ethan. My voice trembled. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, just like it always had, but the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Then I saw him. He was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, his back against the wall, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. Ethan, I whispered, crossing the room. What are you doing here? He didn't look up. I messed up, he said, his voice raw. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He finally lifted his head, and the pain in his eyes nearly broke me. I knew what David was doing, he said. I followed him. I saw him with her. And I confronted him. I knelt beside him, my heart pounding. What happened? Ethan swallowed hard. We fought. He said it wasn't my business, that you'd never believe me if I told you. And I let him walk away. Tears welled in my eyes. I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you, he continued. But then he died. My breath caught. What? He looked away. The night he died, I saw him. What are you saying? His hands trembled. He was drunk. I tried to stop him from getting in the car, but he pushed me. Drove off anyway. And the accident? He shook his head. It wasn't an accident, Claire. My body went cold. What do you mean? His voice broke. I let him drive off knowing he was too drunk to make it home. I didn't stop him. No, I whispered, stepping back. That's not true. But deep down I knew it was. He had tried to protect me, from the truth, from himself. I couldn't breathe. Claire, Ethan said, reaching for me. I flinched, and the hurt in his eyes gutted me. I loved you, he whispered. I still do. The words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I can't do this, I said, tears streaming down my face. I can't. I turned and ran, leaving him alone in the cabin. But as I drove away, my heart shattered. Because despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, I still loved him too. The days that followed felt like a blur. I stayed away from Ethan, ignoring his calls and texts. I buried myself in work, trying to rebuild the walls I had let crumble around me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened, or the ache in my chest every time I thought about him. I hated myself for missing him, for craving the safety of his arms, even after learning the truth. David's betrayal had shattered my trust, but Ethan's confession destroyed something deeper. My belief in the people I loved. And yet, part of me still understood him. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He had been trying to protect me, to shield me from the pain he knew would tear me apart. But in doing so, he had only made it worse. When I finally answered his call, my heart raced. Claire, he said, his voice heavy with relief. Thank God. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, he continued. For everything. For not telling you the truth sooner. For letting it get this far. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You should have trusted me. I know. His voice broke, and it nearly undid me. But I swear, Claire, I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. For a moment, I considered hanging up. Walking away. Pretending this had never happened. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me. The raw honesty in his eyes when he told me he loved me. And I couldn't let him go. We can't go back, I said finally. I know, he whispered. But maybe we can find a way forward. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a promise. But it was enough. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and I kept our distance. We both needed time, to heal, to process, to figure out who we were without each other. But even as I focused on rebuilding my life, I couldn't forget the way he made me feel. The way he had always been there when I needed him most. And maybe that was the hardest part, accepting that sometimes love isn't enough to fix what's broken. But it's enough to make you want to try. Moral reflection. This story isn't about perfect love or happy endings. It's about the messy, complicated truth of relationships. The lies we tell to protect the people we care about, and the damage those lies can cause. It's about learning to trust again, even after betrayal. And most of all, it's about finding the strength to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Because in the end, the only way to move forward is to confront the past and decide whether to let it define you or set you free. What would you do if someone you trusted kept secrets that could change your life forever? Could you forgive them, or would you walk away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories filled with twists, betrayals, and shocking truths. Stay tuned, because the next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and trust.